Welcome to Rates and Barrels. It's Thursday, January 9th. Derek VanRiper, Sarris, Trevor May, full house here with you today. We got a special episode. We're calling this How to Become a Pitching Nerd. And I think there's like a biography element to this real quick that we should get into. Like, Trevor, when did you realize that you were a nerd about pitching? At what point in your life or in your career did it click? You're like, whoa, I'm more into some granular or detailed aspects of this than other people around me. And you were surrounded by pros. You were there, right? At what point did you know you were also a nerd?
Well, I've known my whole life that I was into the nerdier side of things. But it was about what was available when it became really clear to me. But like I have my mom literally just gave this to me a few weeks ago, a big box full of a bunch of stuff I did in high school, just some of my high school stuff. There's a big binder and I kept every stat, like what I could. I tried to remember everything that happened in the game, how many innings I threw, strikeouts, all the stuff. Of course, I probably embellished quite a few times. But like I used to keep my statistics since I was like 10, just because it was interesting. I just liked the aggregation. My wife calls it number go up. I love grinding things out. So when I play video games and stuff, I play games that also are number go up. So, so it started there. Probably in high school, I realized I'm like, yeah, no one else keeps their stats. And this is an advantage. And then in pro ball, I was always interested in like, we have video and we have like the box scores and stuff, but I was like, there's so many steps between correlation between like using this stuff. And then when advanced analytics happened, started to get more used by teams and there was a room of nerds and I realized I was spending more time in there than I was in the locker room. That's when I was like, oh, this is the way that I can get an advantage, or this is the way that I'm going to become the best version of myself. I got to use this strength or this natural like interest I have. So that's when I really leaned into it. And but of course then I just overloaded myself and had to figure out how to use it right. But yeah, so I guess two phases, high school and then probably when I was like 24, 25.
Yeah, and it's changed a bunch of times along the way, right? Like the stuff that you've been able to access readily has changed a few different times along the way. But same question.
I realized that
start?
Trevor May was a pitching nerd when Max Scherzer was yelling at me about Stuff Plus, which was not even the first time that he yelled at me about Stuff Plus. It was like the fourth or fifth time, but it was the first time that another player took part in the conversation and basically defended me a little bit.
Yeah.
So
it was in Oakland.
Really appreciated that.
I remember that. We were lockers next to each other and yeah.
But for me, it was, I think one of the things I was extremely lucky to grow up watching Greg Maddux and Tom Glavine and John Smoltz. And what was interesting about them and Steve Avery, actually, I thought that was important because the four of those guys, and Steve Avery doesn't get the love or anything, but the four of those guys pitched very differently. They're like maybe archetypes in the history of baseball. In that Tom Glavine is your kind of soft tossing changeup command guy, and John Smoltz is your power four seam slider guy, and then Greg Maddux is movement and command, and then Steve Avery was big curveball, a little bit like the Barry Zito's, Adam Wainwrights of the world. I think if he'd had a longer career, we might appreciate him more. But we had these four archetypes, and so growing up, I already had this like, which one is better? That's something you spend a lot of your time as a kid with other kids discussing. And, anytime you're like playing stickball or whatever, you get to be like, oh, I'm, what am I? Like, who am I? And I was always like Gary Sheffield with the bat wag when I was at the plate. And I was always John Smoltz when I was on the mound. And so I had to kind of think about why I'd made those choices as a fan. And I got to sit nearly behind home plate for weird reasons. And I got to see all the movement. So that just really set me up. And then when I was writing about fantasy, it was obvious that pitching was my best foot forward. And that was where I was doing my best analysis. So, that was it. But that, I think early on, I realized that I cared about these things a little bit more and in a little bit more detail than some of the other kids my age.
I think I started with some fruit snacks that were numbers when I was about 5 years old. Those were always the go-to fruit snacks for me. That was the beginning of realizing I was a nerd. They wanted Flintstones or Power Rangers or whatever. Like they wanted cool stuff, and I'm like, no, give me the numbers. I want numbers. I want to do math while I eat my fruit snacks. That was.
I love the number go up though, because I had a pretty extensive card collection, and I had like 3 binders, and the first binder was like, not a common, but not $1. And the second binder was everything over $1, but not like over $5. The third binder was sort of like 5 to 10, and then they got a jewel case if it was over $10.
Yeah,
and
use the Beckett. Just go through the Beckett.
Yeah, I got the Beckett. I would go through them, and I'd move them. I would move them from binder to binder and be like, oh, you moved into the big binder, or like, you open a card, you open a pack with the Beckett so that you can kind of just like go through it right away. And to this day, I spent not most of, but a lot of the break sorting through cards. It's a little bit more depressing these days because you can find a good card, but it has to be like the pink refractor with the mojo wave for it to be like, really worthwhile. Just the regular base card is, not worth anything.
Oh man, lugging the Beckett's around. I mean, I had a subscription, I think, at one point. Every month, like, oh, what's up? What's down? What's cracked that $1, $5 threshold? Yeah, same key numbers. But all right, so a lot of this comes back to fantasy analysis, just general player analysis too, and thinking about things we see, we watch a game, things we hear if we're listening to a game. And I think Trevor has an interesting job that started up this year, being part of the Nerdcast, where you have the challenge of presenting a lot of advanced stuff to people that maybe have never heard it before. Sometimes people that are like lukewarm about hearing it, they're just there because that was the channel they flipped the game on, and you got to make it digestible, right? So that's what we're going to try to do over the course of this show, is talk about some of the things we really care about when we're analyzing players, try to break it down in a way that can make it a little easier to get to if it's something you either haven't done before or it's just something that's been challenging in the past, right? So at the beginning, like, what do you want to know when you pull up a player's page? Like, what information do you want to have? What are the basic things that you think are important to know about a pitcher? And where do you like to go to even get that information with so many different options at your disposal now,
I just gravitate towards strikeout rate. Strikeout rate and strikeout minus walk rate is an incredibly powerful tool for all the stuff that we've come up since. And you talk about in-zone whiff rates or stuff or all this stuff. One of the most powerful predictors is just strikeout minus walk rate. And that's why you have people like general manager of the Tigers, Scott Bush, or I think he might be president of baseball operations. Sorry. But you have him talking about controlling the zone being, at the plate hitting and pitching being like basically the key to baseball. And, I think in some ways he's right because, at least from a pitching standpoint, if you strike guys out and you don't walk them, that's the game. That's pretty much it. And there's a lot of nuance we'll get into after this, but that's where I start.
How about you, Trevor? What's the basic for you? Where do you want to go when you begin to put that profile together?
Well, I want to say even the step even before what you're going to look at, and for those of you at home, focus on like having a good question first. I think that sometimes things get like people go, "Is he good or bad?" Like that's not. There's just too much nuance. You're going to be bouncing around and going yes and no and yes and no if you don't narrow it down a little bit more. And so the goal usually is to figure out which one of those archetypes that mentioned earlier that the guy is, and then go from there based on what you know about what those guys usually do. And then the fun thing is when you find them doing things that outside of the scope of things where they're like a hybrid or whatever. So I use the similar, I think the walk rate and the strikeout rate are a great place to start, because it's so representative of, swing and miss versus not swing and miss. Those are kind of two hallmarks of different kind of archetypes. Though swing and miss has become, I think, more common and more guys have that as part of their. We don't have guys who are striking out 4 per 9 anymore. You just don't go to the big leagues if you do that. You can't do that anymore. You can't you'd be like a Jim Cott or like it's just doesn't exist. But you understand that
even our sinker ballers
or sinker baller, that
still strike out
relies
league
heavily.
average guys.
Yeah, exactly. So K to walk percentage ratios are one, and then right after that, it would probably go to ground ball versus fly ball. All right, so that you can then keep developing the archetype, which is attached to like the home run rate. So you're like, okay, you strike out a lot of guys, cool. But when you give up contact, are they home runs? And if the home run rate's low, you're okay, we're cooking now. And now you're starting to build a good picture. Then you can start getting granular based on the archetype you just said. So like that's kind of the process. But the walk and strikeout rates, like you can even I usually get a fairly good idea by just going like, how many innings have you thrown, how many walks do you have, and how many strikes. Like you don't actually. I don't feel like I need to be exact with that because it can get kind of. You want to see if there's something glaring there, and if it's about average across the board, it doesn't really tell you much. Then you go a little bit farther down. So that's kind of how I try to approach it.
Yeah, and one thing that's just changed over time since the three of us got into baseball 25 years ago now, the stats per nine, like those are much less prevalent in the conversation now. We have K percentage and BB percentage. We have better ways to look at individual skills. And I think you can still take away a good idea of, oh yeah, this guy does miss a lot of bats. Oh, this guy does walk too many guys, or he doesn't walk a lot of guys. You can do that with the Ks per nine and walks per nine. But I think changing the denominator to batters faced and having K percentage and walk percentage just gives you a more accurate snapshot. Put together this board, just looking at some guys that have below average strikeouts per nine and above average strikeout percentages, right? So you can get a little bit tripped up just by looking at the wrong list. It's usually kind of in the middle. It's not like you're going to be way off on guys, but I do think this is a shift I've seen the last few years that I'm totally on board with because it's much more intuitive to me to just think about the percentage of total batters faced that you struck out, right? You see elite relievers run like a 40% K rate. That's easier to understand than 18 Ks per nine, especially for a guy that probably pitches one inning at a time.
Right. I think the per nine, and especially with starting pitchers, pitching fewer innings themselves, it's the per nine thing kind of goes out the door a little bit. And then what you notice is there's a link between strikeouts per nines and walk per nine, because if you look here, all these pitchers have really great walk rates. And what happens is if you have a bad walk rate, if you put a guy on, that's another chance to strike somebody out. Now, are you any better because you put that guy on and gave yourself another chance to strike out a guy in that inning? No, not necessarily. So these pitchers actually can strike guys out at an average or better than average rate. It's just masked by the fact that they don't walk anybody, and that gives them fewer chances to strike guys out. So it's not that any of these guys are real standouts, although Kirby and Burns are pretty good for strikeout rate. It's just that you might look at their K9 and say, oh, these guys don't strike anybody out. And I don't think that's the case either. So it's just a little bit more precise to use a strikeout rate, strikeout percentage rather than K per nine.
The other broader application here, we're trying to understand what players do well. A lot of times we're trying to make predictions, trying to figure out what's going to happen next. That's a huge part of our show. It's a huge part of playing fantasy baseball. So, you put together some year-to-year correlations of a bunch of different pitching metrics. And it's interesting, and it's not really that surprising. When you start to look at very granular skills, you see better, stronger year-to-year correlations than you do on results-based metrics like ERA, for example.
Yeah, and this is part of why I look beyond ERA, even to judge how good a player has been this year, because it's not a really good estimator of true talent. If it's this noisy year to year, it's not really telling you that much. And on the left, what you'll find is ground ball rates, fly ball rates, things like stuff, swinging strike rate, strikeout rate. These are all really strong year to year, meaning that they're giving you a lot of signal. And so this is a little bit of when Trevor and I talk about, going to ground ball rates and going to strikeout rates, this is why we do it, because it's giving us more signal. It's telling us more about what's happening on the plate, having behind the scenes what's really, really happening. When you look at something like line drive rate, that is incredibly noisy. You could look at a player and say, oh, in the first couple of months of 2024, this guy has given up the lowest line drive rate in baseball. Well, this graph here tells you that that's not very predictive. The numbers with the stats with a higher correlation year to year are more predictive. The ones with the lower, so line drive rate, batting average on balls in play, home run rate, that's noise. If you got a player that suddenly has broken out, it seems, but is just not giving up any home runs, it's just not likely they'll continue that. They'll go and regress to their career norms when it comes to home run rate. And so that's why this chart right here is a lot of the basis of the way I analyze baseball. I'm looking for things that are sticky year to year, that are predictive, and tell us more about what's actually happening. And I want to avoid talking about the things that are not predictive.
I love that, by the way, that chart so much, because for my whole career, my left on base percentage was always high. And there was constantly like, oh, he's done a really good job for 5 straight years, but he's going to regress to it's not that core. It comes down to the way I kind of think about it is, and that chart kind of displays this beautifully, is how many scenarios or how many situations that are encompassed in that statistic can be value outliers, meaning it could go from being really low value for you or high value for you. What's the range of that, and how many options are there in that range that are indicative by that stat? And when you come down to ground ball percent, like, you give up a ground ball, you can't give up a home run. Like, that's not possible. Like, so that's not in the equation, which is the highest value thing a hitter can do against you. So once it's going to correlate better with your success if you don't give up a ton of fly balls. It just generally does. You're just not going to give up a lot of home runs if you're not giving up a lot of fly balls. But when you go to ERA, there's so many things that could your defense could be terrible and your score could be like those two things happen.
You could be on the road. You get the road scoring or the home.
There's nothing there's nothing you can do about these things. There's none of these things out of your control. And a lot of like left on base has to do with how your infielders hold guys and how your catcher can throw and all this stuff that you don't have any control over. And so it is fun to kind of look high level and say, hey, could this tell me where else to look? That's kind of what I use those type of things for. Because if it's outrageously high and there is some bad luck when you never have bad luck usually, then it points you to whether or not the defense is bad or not. And you can go find that, as opposed to just being like, well, I don't know, and then moving on to the next thing. I think that's where the value is in those statistics.
Yeah, I think the large swath of batted balls in play don't necessarily get as much attention as they probably should. Like, I remember when BABIP was new as like a public-facing stat, and I think there was this belief that, BABIP should be about the same. Like, the league BABIP should be 300, or there's like a spot where it should be. It's like, no, of course not. The type of contact you allow is going to make a big difference, and your defense is going to make a huge difference. And when you see extremes in either direction, that's when you dig deeper. Okay, why is this pitcher running a 360 BABIP? What was the career rate? Each pitcher's individual baseline, I think, was something that we kind of figured out quickly. That's what we should be looking at. How much are you off of your own established norm, and is that the result of your own skills loss or factors that are outside of your control, right? So
one thing that I think that can kind of like a couple of things that you just said together in kind of a historical way is that we've had these big sort of discoveries in sabermetrics or whatever, and one of them was called DIPS theory, and that's defense independent pitching. And the idea is that basically the batting average on balls in play across baseball is around 300 every year. And a pitcher who has like a 240 one year is not any more likely to have a 240 again the next year on that batting average on balls in play. They're more likely to regress to that mean, that 300. And that sort of spawned this whole slew of stats, and we did gain knowledge from that. There's something called fielding independent pitching that is actually more predictive than ERA. Because why? It takes all balls in play out of it except for home runs, strikeouts, and walks. And by focusing on those three things, it became more predictive than ERA. And that was a great advancement. It's maybe not as important anymore because we've developed better things. And we also developed this understanding that, there's a pitcher's, own baseline, and that the more information we get about the single pitcher, the more we can say, okay, this guy, Tom Glavine, he has a low BABIP because he throws a changeup. He gets people swinging outside the zone. It's soft contact. He's a soft contact merchant. If we have somebody who looks like Tom Glavine and we have 2 months of him, we probably shouldn't anoint him Tom Glavine right away. We should probably wait to get a little bit more information. Somebody like Corbin Burns throws a cutter a lot, and he has a low BABIP for his career, like a 270 or something. I think that, given how long we've seen Corbin Burns be dominant, this is 4 full seasons, we can start to believe that he can suppress balls in play, given that his main fastball is this strong cutter. And that's going to suppress balls in play. That's going to suppress his BABIP. I'm a believer in, a lower BABIP for him. I'm on a group chat with someone who told me he believes in it around 20%, and he thinks I believe in it around 70%. So there's always going to be nuance in these things. And, one thing that I think, there's this temptation when we find these new, discoveries to be like, oh, this is true, and it's true for everyone. And, I don't care that Trevor May's left on base percentage was, what it was for so long. It's 70% across the board every year. So I'm going to predict him to have a 70% next year, and I don't care what he's done before. I think that we should keep an open mind to investigating pitchers a little bit on a unique level, because their mix, their skill set, what they put together is unique, and they may prove to be an outlier. Now, you should be a little skeptical at the beginning, given this research that we found, but as they give you more and more information, the more you can believe in it, I think.
There's another way to kind of paint with a broad brush here, though, with the balls in play, right? There's ground balls and fly balls. And I realize within fly balls, there's a lot of different types of batted balls there. There's infield fly balls, there are line drives, there are just fly balls that go to the outfield, and even fly balls that go to the outfield are hit in very different ways. But, you put together this chart looking at ground ball pitchers versus fly ball pitchers, and just the differences that we tend to see with strikeout rate in particular. That kind of jumps off the page. Home run percentage, not a surprise. Fly ball pitchers give up more home runs than ground ball pitchers. That one kind of explains itself. But do you also find that when you look at pitchers in buckets like this, you gravitate more toward outliers, like the ground ball guy that also has the K rate, that's higher than expected, right? Do you start to dig into the more unique aspects of pitchers that should fit into one of these groups but clearly don't?
Well, I just think that some of my takeaway here is that we want pitchers to, give up ground balls versus fly balls. But when you start grouping pitchers like this, and this is over the last 3 years, if you look at the ground ball pitchers, they are giving up stuff where other, they're giving up whiffs. Because in order to get ground balls, you pitch more at the bottom of the zone. There are fewer whiffs at the bottom of the zone. And so you have that lower strikeout rate. Those are outs, So the fly ball guys are saying, well, I'm going to get, they have a 25% strikeout rate versus the ground ball guys have a 21% strikeout rate. Fly ball guys are saying, I want those outs. And when you look at balls in play, the sort of seeing eye grounder gets a hit a little bit more often than those lazy fly balls. So the fly ball batting average on balls in play is lower than the ground ball one. And you see that reflected in the pitchers, where the fly ball pitchers have a 270 BABIP around, and the ground ball ones have a 300 as a group. And so, when you get all the way down to like an ERA estimator like Sierra, you might be surprised to find that they're not that far apart. The top 10% in ground ball rate over the last 3 years among starters have a 3.85 Sierra, and the top 10% among fly ball guys have a 3.98. If you're trying to play fantasy baseball and you're looking at this, you might take the fly ball guys because there's not that much of a difference, and you get the extra strikeouts, and strikeouts are a category. If you're a team that has a big park, like Oakland, you might gravitate towards the fly ball guys because you say my park suppresses home runs, and so I like all these other things. And then you might understand that why Colorado throws their fastballs low in the zone when nobody else does. I think they're a little bit afraid of the home run. Cincinnati, New York, these are places where people throw more low fastballs, even LA. And some of that has to do with being afraid of how the park interacts with home run rates. So this just sort of shows you that these archetypes, as different as they may be, are surprisingly similar, and that when you become a ground ball guy, you give up some of the things. When you become a fly ball guy, you give up something. You're trading homers for strikeouts. And it explains a lot of what happens, in baseball. And I think baseball has been trending more towards, we want the strikeout guy, we'll give up the home runs if we get those strikeouts, and so on. So this is just the last 3 years trying to look at what the difference is between ground ball guys and fly ball guys.
Yeah, Trevor, do you think the shift in the game has moved away from guys like trying to be ground ball pitchers? Like generally, it's just not a thing. Like if it happens to work that way, if the stuff, the arsenal, the pitches a guy has, where he locates well, work that way, or if the situations call for it, maybe there's a little bit of that to it as well. But it just doesn't seem like this is something a lot of aspiring big leaguers want to do the way they did 10 plus years ago.
Yeah, there's a bunch of reasons, and yes, I agree that it has gone to the wayside, like the term just let him hit it or pitch to contact, which I hate.
Yeah.
I've always hated that term just because it feels like you are, in my mind, I was always like relinquishing a little bit of competitiveness. It's inevitable you're going to hit it. So like, I'm already like kind of going to plan B.
Giving in,
from the beginning. And I understand the value of it, because that comes when you're developing a pitcher, you're trying to make it simple. And you're trying to make guys not worry about too many things. And some keep it simple, stupid, another thing that everyone says. There's a lot of platitudes in baseball. And that works for a lot of people. Like I totally understand. The reason it's gone to the wayside is the strikeout is the analytics movement. Basically every big thinker early, as they all joined teams, they would just say things like, what is the currency of baseball? We're trading and runs. So how do we prevent them? How do we score them? Once it becomes an equation like that, how do you equal runs and how do you prevent runs? You try to look at where the highest, like the no value situations are, and a strikeout is very unlikely to score a run, to produce a run. It just is. It could in swings and misses. Sometimes that guy gets a base, but it's very rare.
The BABIP on a strikeout is almost zero, and the BABIP
it's almost play, basically zero. Yeah,
300.
So you chasing that. The more often we can get this not going to produce a run situation to happen, the better. That makes a lot of sense, but then you get nuance from there. So I think we're seeing guys who throw the sinkers coming back in a way, and we're thinking about it like, I want to throw it in a place where I can get a swing and miss, but I probably won't happen as much. But the next thing I want is something softly hit, and then we'll deal with it from there. Then it becomes plan B again, as opposed to being the first thing you're trying to do. But one thing Eno said that I think is awesome is the way that it's trade-offs, and it always kind of ends up like the game shifts a little bit year to year, but a sinker guy or a ground ball guy versus a fly ball guy doesn't really deviate in terms of overall value generally. Like one's not way more valuable than the other overall usually, but it's about when you're deploying these people. So if you're coming out guy second and third with one out, in the sixth inning, you're pulling your starter to bring a guy who's a ground ball guy. You don't have a double play. Ground ball's going to increase the chances that those two guys score if this guy can't go get a strikeout to get the 2 outs. Like that's a situation where you need a dude who you might be like, yeah, he might walk this guy. It's just as likely to walk him as to strike him out. But if he walks him base loaded, then he gets a strikeout. It doesn't matter. So he's more valuable in this moment than the other one. So you can't just stack your team with one type of guy. And when it comes down to sinker guys or ground ball guys, starters can get away with stuff like that a little bit more. And then so a guy that did that, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, was Scherzer. Scherzer was like, I'm okay flipping over a big curveball to get a guy to roll over in the first because I want to go deep into games. But if I need to turn into monster strikeout guy, I know when to do that. Yeah. I can turn it on and turn it off. And those are the best starters, I think, guys that can cruise, and then guys can go like Wheeler does it pretty well. He goes into, I need some strikeouts, and he has the ability to do it, but he doesn't need to do it all the time because at the end of the day, he wants to get as deep in the game as possible. That's his main goal.
And you're touching on something that I think is really important now, which it doesn't actually take a really big sense of analytics or anything. Is that the larger arsenals are more in vogue. We're seeing more cutters and more sinkers. We're seeing more fastballs. When I look at my rankings that are coming up, guys that seem to just be really solid and maybe sometimes outperform some of our expectations. Wheeler is like, the god of this, has 6 pitches, 3 fastballs, command of all of them, and the fastball is great. That's a great example, but there are other guys that have a lot of fastballs and are good, that kind of do a little better than you might expect. Like Max Fried always seems to outproduce his projections, and it's because he has these extra fastballs. Hunter Brown added a sinker and became more of a 3 fastball large mix guy. Aaron Nola added a cutter and has become more of a 3-pitch 3 fastball guy. Sonny Gray has been aging pretty well. 3 fastballs, 6 pitches. Schwellenbach kind of came on the scene last year. 3 fastballs, 6 pitches. So a lot of these guys that that we like have multiple fastballs, and they're working in what you're talking about. They're trying to do different things. There was a big signing, Justin Verlander to the Giants, 1 year, $15 million. Who he'll come up again later. But one of the things that I want for him is to vary his fastball approach, because he was told when he came from Detroit to Houston, your fastball has great spin, great ride. It plays at the top of the zone. Throw it at the top of the zone for more whiffs. And that led to a renaissance for Justin Verlander that created Cy Youngs and championships. And, that was great for him. He's on the other end of his career. This is going to be one of his last years. He had one of his worst seasons last year. He's still working on the playbook. I have a dominant fastball. I'm going to throw it high in the zone. What I want him to do is throw it low in the zone. Not a lot, not all the time. I want him to throw some fastball, because if you look at his slider, it should be good. Stuff says it's good. It's an 87 mile an hour slider. We know that 87 mile an hour slider is supposed to be good. Like, it should be a good slider, but they're not chasing on it outside the zone anymore. And I think that's because they're like, man, I'm hungry for that high fastball. I like it now. It's 93. It doesn't have as much ride. I like that high fastball. And if I'm going to be hungry for that high fastball, that slider outside the zone doesn't look good to me anymore. What happens if he throws some low fastballs? Now the hitter takes it because he thinks it's a slider, and they get, called strike. And now you got count leverage.
Now both those pitches are better.
Both those pitches are better, right? And if you throw the low fastball like that down in your head, and now you can't just sit high fastball. There might be a low fastball. It's going to make the slider better. So I want him to become a little bit more nuanced in what he's doing. That's jumping ahead a couple steps, but it's relevant to what we're talking about in terms of fastballs, what's in vogue. In terms of sinker ballers right now, we have Framber Valdez and we have Logan Webb, Christopher Sanchez. It's not a really long list. Those are the guys that come to mind. Ranger Suarez, yeah, that's
and technically Minaya, but he's throwing singers up, which is a whole different thing. So we're not going to get into that.
Right. Yeah, we got into the 2-seamer in great detail last year, like February, March or so. We were kind of going pitch by pitch. So if you want to hear a little bit about how 2-seamers have changed and where they're being thrown and why that works, there's a lot in that episode. Yeah, I think it's last February. It's been a while, but there's another aspect to this. Like, okay, so the core skills, the strikeout rates, the walk rates, the things we were talking about at the top of the show, you can get them lots of places. Fangraphs, you can get Baseball Reference, almost anywhere that has baseball stats. Once you have the core skills in mind for a pitcher and you want to start looking at things like the pitches they throw, I feel like there's one place I always gravitate toward, and it's Baseball Savant. And I think it's because they have a lot of good visualizations that you can dig into when you want to go deeper. But even the real basic stuff, it's just easy to look at the player card and see, here are 4 pitches, here are 5 pitches, here's the velocity on those pitches, here's how often they throw each of those pitches, and here's the league average velocity on each of those pitches, all just right there, top of the player card. And I find that to be kind of the best way to pair the core individual skills with the results sort of stuff that I'm looking at first. I'm like, okay, so this is how they get there. This is the stuff that they're using to make this happen. So what do you guys look for when you're starting to break down a pitcher's arsenal? The core things. Number of pitches came up before, right? I mean, more is generally better, always better? Is there a time where more pitches is a bad thing? Like maybe if the quality of those pitches is just awful, it starts to work against you a little bit. But I have come to the point where changing what the hitter can rely on is such a huge part of it. Keeping them guessing probably adds a lot of value, even if those pitches are kind of average or even a tick below in many cases. But what else are you looking for when you're starting to analyze an arsenal on a player page?
You go first, Vino?
Well, I think one of the easiest things, we're often looking for like breakouts or, this player has changed his performance and like, what, do I believe in it or not? And I think one of the easiest ways to, see that is change in pitch mix. Like you said, you can't just look at number of pitches and say that pitcher is good. Kyle Gibson has 6 pitches and Seth Lugo has 6 pitches and Zach Wheeler has 6 pitches. That does not mean that they are the same. As much as I love Kyle, he's not Zach Wheeler. I think he would agree. And so one of the things I like to look at is change of pitches and change of mix. And what you'll see here is the Garrett Crochet's pitch mix change. And when he first came into starting, he was throwing a 4-seamer, and the second pitch that he threw the most often was the sweeper. And what he found was the sweeper righties were hitting it really well. And so you see over the course of the season the rise of the cutter. That's the brown pitch. And he was really dominant, through the middle of the season, just being a fastball cutter guy because he has such a great fastball, and velo, is another easy way to see this. He has great velo. We can get into pitch shape later, but great velo, great cutter. But if we were talking about next year, I almost find that last month or so to be really interesting as well, where Garrett Crochet brought in a sinker and then also brought the sweeper back and almost was a 4-pitch. I mean, pretty much was a 4-pitch pitcher for the last 2 or 3 starts of his season there. And if you're looking to think like, what will Garrett Crochet do this year? I think he's going to look a little bit more like he did in September when he had 4 pitches. And, was dominant, but in a way that might be more useful for a full season because he has 4 pitches and become more of a starter. I think that pitch mix tells you a lot. So just looking at his pitch mix, looking at the pitches he trusts, looking at the pitches that are getting outs, will tell you, how many pitches does he trust? And right now, 4, and I think that's a good number.
Yeah, Arsenal's big thing. What pitches and what are the usages are like first thing kind of. It's also the kind of the first thing on the page too. So that's helpful. Another thing, the big thing I want to do, especially it comes down to like, what question are we trying to answer? Are we trying to predict what this person's going to do? Or are we trying to figure out how they've been performing versus the league? Which that one thing that Savant does so well is has all of the those major categories all represented with the red and the blue lines with the where you rank in the league. So if you see a lot of red, it's usually a good thing. I think that's a pretty solid place to start. And if you don't see a lot of red, you can start to go look under the hood a little bit more. So I always want to know how those things have changed over time. I love the game to game too, because that takes me into their brain, into their mind, so that now if I am, for example, if I'm watching a Garrett Crochet start, for the first time since May, and we're doing, for example, the Nerdcast on Sunday Night Baseball or something, that is really interesting stuff to know because it might change what he'll throw in different situations, and you can kind of talk about that shift in his mindset and where his confidence is. You can see where it is when his back's against the wall. Is he just going to go to the best pitch he has, or is he going to do something else that may indicate his game plan change a little bit, or they're sticking over the catcher or something, which is all very interesting kind of stories to tell. A couple other little things that I like to do as well is go check out the rankings in the league versus others and the run value of each pitch that's farther down the page. Because I did this the other day with Charlie Morton. We're talking about him on Sirius XM, and his curveball is always his positive pitch, run value. Always, it's always his highest value pitch. But that doesn't necessarily mean you can just go and throw curveballs. It usually tells you, one, how good the curveball, how well it's locating and how well it's moving, but also how well the other pitches are being used. because they're there to set it up. Like that's how curveballs work. With that knowledge, you can then start to say, moving forward with the Orioles, what was the biggest issues last year? For example, Charlie, a big thing for him was command of his fastballs. It was just bad. Like he just threw a lot of fortunes down the middle, threw a lot of cutters down the middle. Those are his two that he throws the most of the time. He wasn't locating those very well, and that made his curveball not get chased as much. And it got better as the year went on, and that was shown in the statistics. So the last thing that I want to make sure I've checked out is also location. And you can go see all the heat maps for where do they throw all the pitches. I want to see tight clusters. I don't want to see pitches off all by themselves all over the place. That speaks to not very great command of that pitch. So the guys with the tightest clusters of the most pitches tend to be able to throw them in the places they want to throw them most often. But also it tells you where they're trying to throw them all the time. Corbin Burns is a great example. You check out all of his pitches are tightly clustered, all of them. And he tells you, he basically throws each pitch type in one spot, and then expands from there. And when guys do that, that means they are pretty dialed in with what they're doing. And it's they're in a rinse and repeat situation if they're healthy. And those are the type of guys you want on your fantasy team, because they're going to come out and output every single week as long as they're pitching. And I think Corbin Burns is a pretty good example of that as well. So it's all of that kind of stuff gives you a top level, I think, of what they throw, how well they throw it to where they want, and what their go-to value pitch is going to be and how they set that up. You can get all of that information from those spots.
I do like the breakdown of number of times the pitches are thrown against righties and lefties too, because you can just at a glance get a sense for how many pitches they actually have for hitters on each side of the plate. You might realize, oh, there's 4 pitches here, but it's 2 pitches against lefties, 2 against righties based on the typical pattern. So maybe that arsenal's not as wide as you might think, just based on what those pitches are or when they throw them.
Yeah, you saw real growth from Clark Schmidt when, he used to be kind of like 2 pitches for lefties and 2 pitches for righties, sinker sweeper for righties, cutter curve for lefties. And he actually took a big step forward when he started throwing, all 4 pitches to both sides. I think that was a big part of his growth last year. So I definitely think I like that. I think that, on the Savant page, there's this part where it says movement, and it is helpful that it's color coded. But if you look at Garrett Crochet's thing, you might say, oh, his cutter has less drop than average. His four seam has less drop than average. Why are these great pitches? You have to remember velo. I mean, he sits 97 from the left side as a starter. So, that's why I think it is important still to look at the run value. You look down at the run value, you see, oh, his four-seam fastball is one of the best in the big leagues this last year, despite the fact that it doesn't have a great ride. So these things all go together. The one problem with run value is that it can be a little bit messy because it does involve the contributions of your teammates. There are, and, my famous example is R.A. Dickey's fastball always had a great run value. Even though he threw it 86 and be tempted to be like, well, maybe it had great movement. No. It's because he threw the knuckleball 85% of the time. And every time he threw the fastball, people were like, whoa, what's that?
Your timing was completely thrown off.
Right. So run value, I think is an okay place to kind of sanity check and check things out. But one of the reasons that we, look at movement, and one of the reasons we, create or have stats like Stuff Plus is because they give you a sense of how the release point, the velo, and the movement all interact. And that's where we start getting into 201, I think, a little bit, because it's a little bit harder to do this stuff. It's harder for me to tell you. I can tell you a few things. A slider over 85 is probably good. If you have better than 20 inches vertical break, and this is vertical break without movement on Savant, if you have more than 20 inches of vertical break, it's a good fastball. In fact, if you look at this list, there's not that many bad fastballs. Tristan McKenzie's velo really fell off, and his command really fell off. But like Javier, Vesia, Estrada, Pepio, Cortez, these are good fastballs. I'm gonna have to throw you a wrinkle here. I put vertical release point on here because Alex Vesia throws 20 inches of vertical break from a foot plus lower than Justin Verlander. So just think about the sort of the geometry of that, where you're getting a short guy throwing a guy with, great ride, throwing a pitch with great ride versus a tall guy throwing a pitch with great ride. You kind of expect it more from the tall guy. And so, even a guy like Pepio or Estrada, throwing it from a foot lower than Verlander, it's less expected for the hitter. So this is where you start. You can kind of do this. This is a pretty easy search to do on Savant, where you just include vertical movement and release point as your output, and you can start to see how different it is for Nick Pivetta to throw a pitch with great ride versus Christian Javier. That foot difference is a big deal. When you stand in the box against Nick Pivetta and you see this tall, big guy with tall release point, you expect more of that movement. So there's a tension between actual movement and sort of expected movement given that release point.
Very well said.
I think movement and ride in particular is something we've talked a lot about on this show, but I think this is an area, like Eno said, it's 201. It's where some people's heads start to spin a little bit. They're like, okay, but why do I care about this? Like, this seems like a bridge too far. If I can look at run value, if I can look at things that take a better snapshot of the result, why do I need to know this? What can we learn by going more granular like this?
In that context, so if we stay even in the release point context with the vert, you got to first establish what the first statistic means. So vertical is, for all intents and purposes, defying gravity, or the perception that it's defying gravity. So if you have a high release point, and human beings, not just hitters, all human beings, we learn to account for objects falling because of gravity. We see it happen every day, all the time. We have to. It's a natural thing that instinct that we get. So when a guy throws a pitch that doesn't react to gravity as much as you saw that it should, you swing under it and you're hitting the bottom of the ball or missing a lot. And that's that's the value of ride, going above bats. And once you know that, you can go, okay, what other elements would increase this effect? And that would be a low release point. Now, one other interesting thing that I would probably even layer on after, because I'd be, okay, these guys got low release points. I was a guy, you mentioned it. This was literally my bread and butter. I'm 6'5". I stood up really tall, and then when I threw, I dropped down really low, and I had like a 5.5 foot. Mine was lower than Vesia's, and I am much taller than him. So I started like Verlander, and I ended like Vesia. And that was, it's jarring, because it's like, that's not what you're supposed to look like. You guys like you don't throw like that. And I had a very long extension. I was always 95 percentile, 95th in the league. So I was also closer to you. And my release point was low because my extension was long, because my arm angle wasn't low. It was just 3/4. It was pretty normal. And so the way I got the low release was by being farther out with extension. Now, some guys throw sidearm, right? That would give you a low release as well. And if you get ride from sidearm, that's a different kind of deception, because it looks like the ball's supposed to run and it doesn't. I think a guy who does that, who has figured it out to his science, Josh Hader. He also throws his sinker that seam shifts into a four seam, which is another thing that's crazy. But I think that to have that low of a release point, he has to do that in order to get ride on his fastball. It wasn't on purpose. I think he's just always done that, and it seems to work. So like, that's why his fastball swung and missed at like so much. So I would add extension on, and then if I'm really getting granular, I would say horizontal release point to give me an angle, or even they have arm angles now, so you can like add an arm angle to that as well and get an idea of where they are in their slot. All of those things would give you an idea of how effective that ride will be. And the really interesting part about all of this, everything you just showed, is the guy with the highest release point, Justin Verlander. What you just showed tells us that throwing in the bottom of the zone would be smart, because it looks like he's going to throw up because he's throwing so high.
You stand in the box and
so their eyes are up. So then bringing it down,
yeah,
it's gonna do the opposite effect. They're gonna think it's gonna go below the zone naturally, and then it's gonna hit the bottom of the zone, and they'll be like, "Oh."
If you could give him
called
even an
strikes,
average sinker, so that he just feels like I'm throwing something else down there, I think that would be huge. But
anything that could go below the zone that they have to respect will make that fastball be taken down there.
And the I think the other part of the question is, why do we care about this stuff? And I think to some extent it's because if you're looking at one or two starts, and this is a little bit more fantasy, but I think it actually is really important in today's league. We're seeing more and more pitchers being used because of injury rates. And so it's more and more likely that if you're a hitter stepping into the box or you're a pitching coach dealing with a pitcher, that you're dealing with a pitcher where you don't have an extensive track record. And you're just like, I've never seen this guy. What am I looking for? And so let's say a guy comes out and either you're a fantasy owner or you're a hitter or you're a pitching coach and you have one start of information on them. If you have one start of information on them, it probably is not like we just showed you. Don't look at his home run rate. It doesn't matter how many home runs he gave. Almost like he could have given up 3, and you'd be like, oh, he's terrible. No, don't do that. It could have just been his first start in the major leagues, and maybe he struck out a bunch of guys, or maybe he didn't. Maybe he didn't wasn't on the same page with the catcher, whatever. Even strikeout rate. These things are more powerful in the smallest samples than strikeout rate, and strikeout rate's the most powerful thing, So when you are looking at somebody who doesn't have a long track record, I think it helps. And so, Jeremiah Estrada, you're saying, he has a, 19 vert. That's great. So I'm looking at this other pitcher, Yuki Matsui. He has a 19-inch vert. That must be great, right? Well, then now you bring in the velo. Okay, well, the velo is a little different on these guys. And then why isn't Tristan McKenzie great? He has it. Well, he's releasing it from almost a foot higher. So these are ways for us to, get beyond the first level stats, which are very powerful, and the more you have to sample, the more you can look at K minus BB, and eventually, like in my example with Tom Glavine, if you have 15 years, you can look at ERA.
Well, and I do think this is where the pitching plus, the stuff plus models that are out there, like those give you I think a much more digestible sense of the characteristics of the pitch without having to get into the granular details of vert and release point, right? You get it back to one number within the arsenal. And I think that's like the entry point into this. And if you want to understand how the model works, that's where you start digging into the very, very hyper specific stuff. But it's there. That's the best part about this. It's all out there now. This stuff wasn't available 10 years ago.
Yeah, and when the Stuff Plus revision comes out, which will be in soon, I promise. The one thing that we have changed is that 100 equals average for a pitcher, and so we've refocused this so that it's a little bit more. And there's like larger ranges, so you can kind of get a better sense of like where pitchers stand on the equivalent to other pitchers versus it used to be kind of the average pitch was 100. We kind of wanted to make it more pitcher based. So when you talk about vertical movement, the average vertical movement is around 16, I think. So, above 16 is good, but you got to watch that vertical release point. The average vertical release point, I think, is around 5.8, 5.9, maybe around 6 actually. So you got to think about that. The average strikeout rate when we're looking at that is up to 22%. So it's got to be over 22% if you want to have a good strikeout rate. It's a good idea to have an idea of what's average, what's elite when you're looking at each of these stats. Then you can get into some real cool stuff. We've included this in Stuff Plus, but I wanted to point this out. You were talking about Josh Hader recently. I can't think of two more opposite pitchers than Josh Hader and Clay Holmes. And so I just wanted to show this as an example of seam shifted wake, where Josh Hader's fastball, if you look at the seams right now, they're not gathering anywhere. Look at the Clay Holmes seams. Let's put that up for one second. Look at the bottom left side of Clay Holmes's ball. There's a seam there all the time. And that seam is gathering there, and that's pulling the ball down. And so Clay Holmes, is really high up in the air, and he throws this ball where the seams are gathering on the bottom, and it just dives. Hader throws a ball where the seams don't gather anywhere. It's just cutting through space. And so it does not dive at all. But Hader's throwing from this, this release point that's way out there, sidearm. And so you, as a batter, you expect this is going to dive, this is going to fall, this is going to have a lot of sideways movement. and then he throws this thing that doesn't because it kind of cuts through the air. Clay Holmes is tall. He throws from a high release point. You expect that ball to have ride like Justin Verlander, and instead he uses the seams on that ball to gather on the bottom and pull it down and give you this tremendous sinker. And that is modern baseball right there. So it's a little bit hard to kind of see that happening, but I think one of the things you just want to be aware of when you're looking at pitchers and you're looking at a small sample pitcher is just deviation from average. You just want them to not be average. You want them to either have plus velo or plus ride relative or weird release point or maybe 6 pitches. Schwellenbach, I'm big on Schwellenbach because he does a lot of these things. He has impressive ride given a weird, like kind of a sidearm slot. He used to be a shortstop, so he throws from like way out there, and he has impressive ride, and he has multiple pitches: fastball, cutter, slider, curve, change. Like, he has a large arsenal, good command. These are the things that I'm looking for in various degrees. You can't always get. I don't have a ton of examples. Like, what's the next Spencer Schwellenbach? It's like, I've got 5 other examples. It's not that easy. But that's what you're looking for in a breakout. And if you were looking at Spencer Schwellenbach early on, when he'd given you just a little bit of information, you could have seen with the stuff plus, with the number of pitches, with the velo, with the release point. If you'd followed along, you would have picked up Spencer Schwellenbach after one start because of these various ideas.
It's interesting, too, if you look at a bunch of the numbers we've talked about over the course of the show, Sierra, look at a leaderboard like that. Schwellenbach was 15th among pitchers with 100 innings pitched last year in Sierra. So, he pops on that leaderboard, but he also pops in terms of K percentage. He's over 25%. He doesn't walk a lot of guys. He's under 5%. Every little thing you could look at, he's good or very good at, which is, it's surprising to me because so much of the conversation around who was going to step up in that rotation was around AJ Smith-Shawver and Hurston Waldrop this time last year. And Schwellenbach comes in and just does all the things people were expecting those two guys to do, if not more.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm really, I think what was the conversation you had with Schwellenbach earlier this past year, about how he's talking about how he's really conscious of his horizontal movement on his four seam because he knows that the more it moves, the less his ride is effective because he's funky.
Yeah, he cuts his four seam
and he's trying to
reduce the horizontal movement so that
it
doesn't look like a kind of a side army sink.
So it doesn't run like a side army run fastball supposed to run. And so they're trying to get hitters see 2 things. They think they see lots of things, but they see 2 main things. One is hand position at release, and then the second kind of 1B decision is the spin. So the adjustment of the swing is the spin. I'm going to swing or I'm not going to swing. Am I going to hold back? Am I going to try to flick it and whatever? And for a guy like both of the guys we just showed, actually, Clay Holmes and Hader, you see the hand position. It's weird. And then you see the spin of the pitch, and both of those spins don't make sense for how they move either. So it's like both decisions they're making are confusing to hitters, and it's hard to get comfortable with unless you see them a bunch of times and then we're both relievers. Not Clay anymore, but and that's why starting pitchers tend to give up more contact than relievers, generally percentage wise. And that's at the end of the day, they're trying to move those pitches off of, like you said, out of that average range into elite one way or the other. If you're like Maranta, you're trying to make it so bad that it's good with your slider, trying to make it go the other way, something that no one ever sees because they see it as breaking normally and it's going backwards. There is such thing as so bad that it's good. That's a real thing in baseball. I don't think it really exists in any other sport. It's just uniqueness. And I think that's what the pitch design revolution has done now. And that's why pitching is so good. I think overall is guys are finding those things quickly and then just putting them in games.
Yeah, if I just wanted to maybe come up with a couple pitchers that kind of maybe satisfy some of these equations. One idea that I had is Osvaldo Bido with the A's. He only has average vertical break on his fastball. However, if you look at his Savant page, you realize he has a 30-degree arm angle. So by having average vertical break from a kind of side army slot, and even his picture on Savant, like his profile picture, you can see his arm slot, and you'd be kind of surprised to have average vertical movement from that arm slot. Given his arm slot, you would expect more sinkery movement. And he does have good sideways movement. Maybe if he cut the ball more like Schwellenbach, he could have a little bit more success. But already he's shown some success, in terms of stuff plus. The numbers are there. He's got above average stuff on. He's got 4 or 5 pitches. He's got multiple fastballs. He throws a four seam and a cutter and a sinker, slider and change. He's had some, success. The run value on 4 of his 5 pitches was positive last year. So there's a lot of things that are popping for him. Luis L. Castillo, the one who just got traded to the Guardians. You see the picture there of Vidot. Look, that's a kind of a side army slot right there. To have average vertical movement out of that is pretty good, and you can see the little the radar thing there with that movement profile.
Radar scope.
A sense. Yeah, the radar scope gives you a sense of, it's also nice sometimes to see a pitcher occupy like lots of space within that radar scope. Like, have different movement profiles of different pitches that take up space in there. That's the batter is going to be looking at those 4 pitches and trying to discern between them, and they're going in different directions. And Castillo has 2 breaking balls and 2 fastballs, and I think has a similar amount of. Does he pass the one question that I'm not sure about, and want to go down a little bit, is does he pass the command test? So as you can see, we're talking about, Trevor was talking about
that would be an example of not tight.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
so
multiple red dots, not good.
The 4 seam's not super tight, but it's okay.
It's the tightest.
The changeup is a scatter shot. The cutter is all over the place. And even the slider, there's a lot of middle sliders there. So, you want him to step forward a little with the command. The nice thing is command is a little bit iffier in terms of being sticky season to season. So this is another thing you can do. Oh, here's a guy who checks all the boxes without command. Let me watch a couple spring starts. Let me see if he's dotting the ball better this year. And so, I think that's a sticky wicket for Luis Castillo too, is command. So, those are 2 guys that, don't have much track record and sort of focusing too hard on ERA, or especially don't look at home run rates or K minus BB even, you might be missing, they have the parts to maybe put it together this year.
Yeah.
So we're looking at the Baseball Savant page if you're just listening to the podcast version of the show. And I want to ask you guys about the visualization on the right side with the movement profiles. Ideally, do you want to see multiple pitches clustered together? Like you can see it's yellow and brown dots for the slider and the cutter that are kind of close together for the movement profile. And then you've got the green and orange and the red stuff, the 4-seamer, slider, and sinker that are all a little closer together. Like, do you want combinations of pitches that look similar to the hitter? Is that something that kind of stands out as good? Like if you saw 4 pitches and they were all scattered all over the place and nothing resembled anything else, wouldn't that make the pitches a little more predictable in the eyes of the hitter?
You want them close, but not too close. So what do you
said? You have the idea of a bridge pitch, right?
You
like
want coverage.
Yeah.
So you want like a lot of real estate being covered by pitches, but you don't necessarily want a lot of overlap from pitch to pitch as much. So that's kind of the best of both worlds. It's a balance.
Skubal occupies more space. Throw up Wheeler too.
Beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful. Look at Wheeler here too.
Skubal's look at Wheeler, dude.
Wheeler's great. And see how they all kind of seem to it's almost like they're moving towards each other.
Yeah, they're connected.
So it's they're connected. He connects them, but they're not overlapping because a lot of teams look and say, you overlap with these 2 pitches a lot. Let's not throw one. Let's make one really good one.
Frankie Montas.
Yes.
His slider and his cutter were the same thing. And they were just throw the harder one.
And at the very end, if you want to just be frustrated, you just check out Justin Steele's crazy variation
well,
because
there's always
he
an
says
outlier.
5 pitches or 1 pitch. So it's the other way. He's just so confusing because you can't tell what he's throwing.
Oh, they're splitting it up a little bit more now.
Oh, they are.
Look at that.
Yeah. Long conversation I had with Mike Petrielli. He's like, dude, this guy is killing me. He's killing me. I don't know what to do. Because he says he's like, I throw fastball slider. And you're like, well, you throw curveball, slider, cutter.
There's kind
sweeper.
of 2 sliders in there. Look at his, if you zoom in a little bit on the yellow, I think that's a slider.
Yeah. The variation there.
There's 2 groupings there. And
Yeah.
that can be interesting too, is to like that shows to me like feel, I guess. Sometimes can be shown in like, oh, these are 2 distinct clusters within one pitch type. That gives
There's
me
also a
sense of,
righty
like,
lefty split there, I believe. We looked that up.
right.
Yeah, we got into Justin Steele as someone that seems to have an advanced ability to manipulate his pitches. Like he doesn't have 6 different pitches necessarily, but he can throw 3 variations of each thing he throws. So then it kind of turns into 6, and unless there's a day where he doesn't have the feel, and then he's down to like 1 pitch.
And sometimes he doesn't. Yeah. Yeah.
And that becomes the downside
pitching.
of Justin Steele.
Yeah.
And one thing that I would also suggest is, even though that the sliders on Savant are so visually appealing and great, and it's a little bit like sometimes people use the Baseball Reference player comparison to like end arguments. Skeen's red across the board. Yes, he's great. There's something blue on there. What is it? Oh,
it's extension.
and you look at Wheeler. It's red mostly across the board, but his barrel rate is low and his ground ball rate is low, and so they're blue. And when people use the Baseball Reference thing, where like there's like 10 categories, and this player wins in 6 or 7 of them, so he's better. Not all those categories are equally important. So if you're looking at these sliders and you see that, Zach Wheeler's great, except for look at his barrel rate. Maybe he's not as good as you think. No, barrel rate is one of the least stickiest things on there. If you think about home run rate, right? Barrel rate is linked to home run rate. And the other one that's a little bit low, ground ball rate. Maybe not that great of a pitcher. He doesn't have many ground balls. Well, we looked earlier, and he's just decided to make a handoff where he'd rather have the strikeouts than get a ton of ground balls. He can get ground balls. So I wouldn't look at his sliders and say, he gives up too many barrels, so Zach Wheeler's not good.
That said, if they're all red, though, if you're 90th percentile in every single thing for hitters and pitchers, you can be very confident that they're one of the best. Like just look at Bobby Witt Jr.'s thing. You're like, he's incredible. Like it's very clear he's incredible.
Yeah, there you go. But he chases a little too much, Trevor. So I think we should dial it back.
Look at those top 6. I'm like, well, you're the best at all the stuff, so I'm gonna give it to you. And then the aggregate ones at the top. If you're 95th percentile in the league,
they do a pretty good job of putting the more important stuff at the top.
Yeah.
And that's why when we were looking at the movement profiles, I just thought this is an interesting choice by Savant to put this chart at the top of the page. It seems like it's important to the people there presenting the data to have that information there. And it's relatively new. It's not something they've had there for more than a few months now. I think maybe it was there all season, but I don't think it was there prior to that. So I think it's something a lot of people are just starting to see and use for the first time as they kind of go through their off-season analysis.
And if you're looking at Wheeler, he brings a lot of the things together that we've been talking about, which is his arm angle is 25 degrees. It's even lower than Bidot's, right? And so what you have to do mentally is you're looking at this chart, and it says that, Wheeler's fastball moves like MLB average, because there's this little shading behind it. And it says, it moves like MLB average. And you have to remember, A, Zach Wheeler throws really hard. B, he throws from a 25-degree arm angle, which is on the same chart. And so he's throwing sidearm and getting average vertical movement on a really hard fastball that he can pump up to 99. So, even when the pitch looks like it's in average territory and like, Zach Wheeler, average movement, not so great. Well, given his arm slot, given his velo, it is great. So they are putting a lot of the right information there. The hardest part about analyzing pitching, I think, is that you still have to kind of, put it together. You still have to kind of like look at a few things and be like, given his arm slot and given the velo, like you kind of, It's not easy to put one number in front of you. If you want one number, just use K minus BB, and you'll probably be right 90% of the time. But
And Stuff Plus. You can use Stuff Plus too.
Yeah.
You use those two, and then just forget everything else that you're just talking about. No, you'll at least survive. You'll survive in your fantasy leagues, and you won't be a total doofus. I think that's how I live most of my life. Actually, just try not to be a total doofus.
If you're looking at a pitcher who's giving you one start, it's like you go to these places, and you can be ahead of the league.
Right, because I do think there are people that get tripped by small sample size results, and this is a great example of how you can get around that and make a better decision than other people in your league or other people that you're watching the game with. We're going to go. Nice long episode today. A lot of news coming up on Friday. I think every time we talk about the Dodgers, they make a move, which makes the things we said about the Dodgers completely useless like 20 minutes later. So we spared ourselves from Dodgers talk today. We'll have that for you on Friday. You can find us on Bluesky. You can join our Discord with the link in the show description. So that's going to do it for this episode of Rates and Barrels. We're back with you on Friday.
Thanks for listening.